As the judge's words echoed through the courtroom, Tiffany Henyard's composure shattered, resembling a scene ripped from a political drama. In an unexpected outburst, she stormed out, her emotional collapse revealing that this trial was about far more than the charges she faced. Was it the mounting corruption accusations catching up with her, or the financial secrets long buried that were now surfacing for the world to see? Perhaps it was a crushing realization that her once untouchable political empire was crumbling, and her supporters had begun to turn against her Henard, who had long evaded accusations of corruption, financial mismanagement, and power-hungry tactics, seemed to have lost control. For months, she had lived on the edge, facing claims of shady business dealings, unethical decisions, and a misuse of public funds. But today, everything came to a head. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the public speculated about what had caused Henard to snap. Would this be the end of her leadership in Dalton, or another dramatic chapter in her increasingly turbulent career? Reporters, political analysts, and citizens filled the room, eager to witness how the once untouchable mayor would handle this critical moment. Henard entered the courtroom without her usual confidence, gone were the designer clothes, lavish press conferences, an imposing presence that had once commanded respect. The atmosphere was tense as the judge took his seat and the room fell silent. At first, Henard appeared composed, almost as if she still believed the charges were part of a political witch hunt, a misunderstanding of her intentions. But as the prosecutor meticulously outlined her questionable transactions, unethical decisions, and millions in taxpayer dollars that had mysteriously disappeared under her watch, her composure crumbled. Her face shifted, and nervous glances were exchanged with her legal team, who knew the weight of the evidence was about to be revealed. The prosecutor wasted no time presenting damning evidence. A $43,000 Amazon shopping spree funded by taxpayer money, extravagant first-class flights, luxury hotel stays, and billboard with Henard's face plastered around town. These weren't minor infractions but blatant, extravagant expenditures that painted a clear picture of corruption. The jury, made up of residents who had once trusted her, watched intently, their faces showing disgust and disappointment as the charges mounted. But the real bombshell came when the prosecutor presented fresh evidence. Emails, wire transfers, and confidential agreements linking Henard to a series of transactions funneling public funds into her accounts. Screenshots of these documents flashed across the courtroom, sending shockwaves through the room. Some of Henard's most loyal supporters gasped, and her legal team scrambled to discredit the evidence. But there was little they could say in her defense. Henard's carefully constructed image of invincibility crumbled before everyone's eyes. Desperate to maintain composure, her eyes darted toward the door, contemplating a dramatic exit. The judge called for the trial to continue, but the damage was already done. The evidence was irrefutable, and the mood in the courtroom shifted. Henard's defense team attempted a last-ditch effort to salvage her reputation, claiming she was a victim of political sabotage. They argued that the evidence had been misinterpreted and that the accusations were an attack on a powerful woman. But the jury was unmoved. They saw the undeniable proof of her misappropriation of taxpayer dollars for personal gain. The prosecution highlighted the contrast between Henard's self-image as a champion of the people and the reality of her actions, using town resources to fund lavish trips, expensive hotels, and personal shopping sprees, all while Dalton's residents faced rising taxes, deteriorating infrastructure, and cuts to essential services. The prosecution then presented a key witness, an insider from Henard's inner circle, who exposed the behind-the-scenes corruption. The witness detailed a culture of fear where dissent was silenced through threats and intimidation. As the details of Henard's leadership tactics were revealed, her image as a strong, decisive leader began to look like a facade built on lies and deceit. Henard, visibly rattled, tried to maintain control, but the weight of the accusations was sinking in when the judge called for a recess. Henard's simmering frustration boiled over. Known for her ability to command any room, she stood up abruptly, challenging the legitimacy of the proceedings. "This whole thing is a political conspiracy against me," she screamed, her voice echoing through the courtroom. Her words sent ripples of tension to the room, and the jury exchanged uneasy glances. Her legal team urged her to remain calm, but Henard, now unraveling, could hardly contain her outrage. It was clear that the woman who had once been a symbol of political power was no longer in control. The battle for her political survival was far from over. The pressure was taking its toll on Tiffany Henyard as she stood in courtroom. No longer the calm, collected politician who once dominated Dalton's political scene, she now seemed a woman on the brink of a meltdown, desperately trying to maintain control. Her emotional collapse became evident, and as she attempted to storm out, the room buzzed with disbelief. Reporters scrambled to capture every moment of the unfolding drama. What had started as a trial was now a public reckoning for a woman who had once been untouchable. The anger in the room was palpable, and Henard, who had thrived on confrontation and power, now appeared vulnerable and unprepared for the consequences of her actions. Was this the beginning of the end for her? Could she recover from this public spectacle, or had the damage to her reputation become irreparable? The people of Dalton were watching closely, their once unwavering faith in her leadership now deeply shaken. Would they continue to stand by her, as she seemed to believe, or would they demand accountability for the trail of corruption she had left behind? The courtroom drama escalated from a political trial into an emotional spectacle, with public reaction growing more intense by the minute. Henard's supporters were dwindling, while the number of people calling for her resignation continued to rise. The evidence of corruption was overwhelming, and her emotional breakdown only fueled the perception that she was losing control, not just of the trial, but of her political future. It was becoming increasingly clear that Henard's days as mayor were numbered. The question wasn't whether she could survive the trial, but whether she could survive the consequences of her actions for the people of Dalton. The once promising future they had hoped for now seemed increasingly out of reach as they watched their mayor's career collapse in a whirlwind of scandal and disgrace. Just as Henard attempted to storm out, an unexpected turn of events unfolded. Federal agents, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, suddenly moved forward and halted her in her tracks. They presented official documents and calmly informed her that she needed to come with them. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. A heavy silence fell over the room. Henard, once an unshakable figure of power in Dalton, was now faced with federal authorities who weren't there for a political spectacle but for serious legal matters. Her supporters, who had once cheered her on, were now paralyzed with shock and uncertainty. The woman who had once commanded every room with sheer force was now powerless in the face of the law. Henyard, realizing she had lost control of the situation, felt the weight of the moment sink in. Her attorneys quickly moved in, whispering urgent instructions for her to leave without further escalation. But Henyard refused to back down. She squared her shoulders and defiantly faced the agents. "This is harassment," she shouted, her voice echoing through the now-still room. "This is political persecution." Her defiant words bounced off the walls, but the audience, having witnessed her fiery outburst before, remained unmoved. There was no applause, no celebration, only a growing sense of disbelief as the facade she had so carefully constructed began to crumble. One of the federal agents, calm and collected, responded with quiet authority. "Miss Henyard, we need you to come with us for further questioning." This is not an arrest at this moment. The words hit Henyard like a ton of bricks, and the gravity of the situation became all too real. The investigation, which had been quietly simmering for months, had now reached a pivotal moment. Henyard, once confident that her influence would protect her from any consequences, realized that the safety net she had relied on had disappeared. The walls had closed in, and the reality of the situation began to set in. The reporters, who had initially focused on documenting the trial, now turned their attention solely to Henyard. Cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every moment of her downfall in real time. Social media exploded with news of the dramatic turn of events. The word meltdown quickly began trending, marking a sharp contrast to the woman who had once been an untouchable political figure. Federal agents from multiple agencies moved into position, their stoic, unreadable faces standing in sharp contrast to the powerful, dominant figure Henard had once been. The woman who had long positioned herself above reproach was now visibly crumbling under the weight of her corruption. Her supporters, once vocal in their admiration, now watched in stunned silence as they saw their mayor confronted by the law. Some loyal followers tried to rally behind her, shouting accusations of a setup, while others quietly slipped away, unsure of how to process the rapid collapse of her power. Tiffany Henyard, once confident and powerful, stepped toward the courthouse doors, fully convinced she still had a chance to salvage the situation. However, it quickly became apparent that her fall from grace was just beginning. The true betrayal came from within her ranks when a key witness, once one of her closest allies, stepped forward and turned against her. This confidant, who had helped cement Henyard's power, was now prepared to testify about the corruption, intimidation, and manipulation that had defined her time in office. The testimony was a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the room as the witness revealed that Henyard's reign wasn't just a political scandal, but the collapse of a regime built on fear, deceit, and control. Henyard's face froze in shock and rage as the gravity of the situation hit her like a freight train. She had always believed herself untouchable, relying on her influence and connections to shield her from real consequences. But now, in front of the world, the truth was being laid bare. Her political empire was crumbling before her eyes, and the walls were closing in as the judge called for a recess. Henyard, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity to regain control of the narrative. She thought she could spin the situation in her favor, talk her way out of it, and reclaim her power. But when the gavel struck, signaling the end of the recess, Henyard's frustration boiled over. She shot up from her seat, gripping the edge of the table, her pulse racing. Never one to sit quietly, she exploded in anger, shouting, "This is a setup. This is all lies. You just can't handle a strong black woman in power." Her voice reverberated through the room in a last-ditch attempt to turn the tide in her favor. The courtroom erupted in shock and disbelief, with reporters scrambling to capture every moment, while the jury exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of how to process her outburst. The prosecution stood silently, arms folded, observing her unraveling. Undeterred, Henyard turned on her heels, convinced she could still salvage the situation. She stormed toward the door, fully expecting to leave the courtroom and regain some semblance of control, but just as she reached the door, she was stopped again by federal agents who had been observing the chaos unfold. They moved swiftly to prevent her from leaving, their calm demeanor standing in sharp contrast to her escalating frustration. "Miss Henyard," one agent said, his voice unwavering, "we need you to come with us for further questioning." There was a deafening silence in the room as the weight of the moment sank in. Henyard, once untouchable, now faced the full force of the law. Her political future, once so certain, had collapsed in front of the eyes of the public. The woman who had once controlled every conversation, every room, was now powerless in the face of an investigation that had already begun its inexorable march toward accountability. The finality of the moment was undeniable. Henyard's once unshakable empire had crumbled into dust, and the reality was that there would be no return. Tiffany Henyard's career, once impervious to consequence, was now collapsing under the weight of the truth. Even her most devoted supporters, those who had stood by her side through thick and thin, watched in stunned silence as they saw her grip on power slipping away. Henyard stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths as the reality of the situation began to sink in. This was not how she had envisioned the day unfolding. She had anticipated a tough decision from the judge, but this was something entirely different. Federal agents, documents in hand, had arrived, and her carefully constructed world was crashing down around her. Her attorneys rushed to her side, whispering urgently, "We need to go now." But Henyard, ever the fighter, wasn't ready to accept defeat. She squared her shoulders, clenched her fists, and shot a defiant glare at the lead agent. Her eyes blazed with determination, as if she could still talk her way out of the situation. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the once unstoppable mayor, who had controlled every room she entered, now found herself powerless in front of the very system she had once thought she could control. The agent stood firm, his gaze unwavering. The eyes of the world were upon Henard as the final chapter of her political career unfolded. The agent spoke again, his voice calm and methodical. "Miss Henyard, we need you to come with us for further questioning." The simple request felt like a crushing blow, and the court fell into an eerie silence. Her arrest hadn't been finalized yet, but it was clear that the investigation had reached a point where her influence and power could no longer shield her. Henyard had always relied on insider connections, reassured that nothing would come of the federal investigation. She had believed she was untouchable, someone whose influence could protect her from any consequence. But now, as federal agents from multiple agencies blocked her path, the harsh reality began to set in. The situation was slipping through her fingers faster than she could regain control. Outside, cameras clicked away, capturing every dramatic turn of events as social media exploded with real-time reports. Tiffany Henyard, once a powerful and untouchable figure, now found herself consumed by the consequences of her actions. The courtroom, which had once been her domain, now felt foreign and hostile. Her lawyer, ever the pragmatist, urged her to move forward with haste. But Henard, her eyes burning with frustration, ignored the advice and stormed toward the courtroom doors, flanked by federal agents. Each step she took was recorded, marking the public collapse of her reign. As she walked the courthouse halls, every step felt like a personal humiliation. The reality of her political downfall weighed heavily on her. Commentators echoed the sentiment, with one remarking, "I came in expecting a courtroom victory, but she's leaving with federal agents by her side." News reporters rushed forward, microphones in hand, hurling questions at her about the corruption investigation, her resignation, and the FBI case against her. Henard's face twitched with annoyance, but she refused to respond, knowing better than offer another soundbite that would further fuel the media frenzy. Instead, she focused on what little narrative she could still control. Once inside the federal building, her PR team scrambled to issue a statement calling the investigation a political witch hunt aimed at silencing a powerful woman. However, leaks from the investigation revealed a much darker reality, and Henard's carefully crafted image of a respected leader began to unravel. The walls were closing in, and Henard's political empire was collapsing faster than she could keep up. The corruption charges piled up, followed by allegations of financial mismanagement, intimidation tactics, and secret offshore accounts. With each new revelation, the situation grew dire. Whistleblowers confirmed long-held suspicions that taxpayer funds meant for community programs had been funneled into dubious consulting fees and unexecuted projects. The situation spiraled into chaos, and then came the bombshell. A secret audio recording surfaced, capturing a conversation in which Henard's voice sneered. "They wouldn't dare speak against me. If they do, we'll make sure they regret it." The recording spread like wildfire across social media, with hashtags like #Henard and #Sale trending globally. Public perception of Henard shifted dramatically. She was now being compared to some of the most corrupt politicians in history, inside her inner circle. Panic reigned as her team scrambled to contain the damage. Lawyers tried to discredit the audio, but it was too late. The truth was slipping beyond her control, and even her staunchest supporters, including local politicians and influencers, began distancing themselves, realizing the scandal was too vast to ignore. On primetime television, anchors declared her political career was in its final moments, with reporters speculating on the severity of the charges she faced, including the possibility of jail time. The accusations held weight, and as Henard sat across from investigators in a federal interrogation room, her usual confidence had evaporated. Replaced by dread, the lead investigator slid a thick folder of evidence across the table, each page telling a damning story. Bank statements showed sizable deposits from a mysterious shell company linked to government contracts, while emails detailed favors for private entities. Documents bearing Henard's signature raised further suspicions. "You can keep playing this game, or you can start telling us the truth," the investigator said coldly for the first time in her career. Henard's defiant facade began to crack. Her smile faded as she stared at the evidence laid before her. And the final piece of the puzzle, an approval of a deal flagged as highly suspicious, sealed her fate. There was no escape now outside the interrogation room. The world moved on. Reporters prepared their evening broadcasts, speculating on her downfall and discussing potential replacements. Social media buzzed with discussions, and citizens once loyal eagerly awaited the next chapter in the unfolding scandal. Inside the room, Henard sat stiffly in her chair, arms crossed and nervously tapping her polished nails against the cold metal table. The walls had closed in around her, and she was alone. Her lawyers were nowhere to be seen, and the reality of her situation had finally set in. She was no longer in control. Tiffany Henyard, once a towering figure in politics, found herself in a desperate struggle for survival. The walls of her political empire had come crashing down, and all that remained was the desperate need to hold on. Even as everything she had built disintegrated around her inside the interrogation room, the reality of Tiffany Henyard's situation hit her hard. What once felt like an ironclad defense now seemed like a fragile house of cards on the verge of collapse. The investigator slid yet another document across the table, this one a sworn statement from a former aide. He shook his head, noting, "We've dealt with politicians like you before. They all believe they're untouchable until they're not." Henard tried to force a smirk, but it didn't reach her eyes. "This is absurd. A smear campaign. You don't have a case," she shot back. But her words fell flat. The gravity of the situation had finally sunk in. She was no longer in control. The door, once potential escape route, now stood silent, and her lawyers, who had once been her safety net, were nowhere to be seen. She was alone. Her options evaporated, leaving only desperation, anger, and fear collide within her as she sat there, feeling the walls close and the full extent of her fall began to settle in. The empire she built, rooted in deceit, manipulation, and backroom deals, was coming apart piece by piece outside the interrogation room. The world had erupted in chaos. News of her federal questioning spread like wildfire. Headlines began drawing comparisons between her downfall and the infamous political scandals of the past. Analysts speculated about the severity of the charges she faced, including the possibility of jail time. Meanwhile, inside her city, once a bastion of support, dissent began to grow. The city council, Henard's staunch allies, held an emergency meeting broadcast live for the world to see. One trustee, who had once been fiercely loyal to Henard, stood before the cameras and declared, "This administration has failed our city." For the first time, Henard's political empire appeared to be crumbling in real time. The trustee called for an immediate investigation, a forensic audit, and, if necessary, her removal from office. Citizens who had once backed her, without question, now clamored for justice. Demonstrations erupted outside City Hall, with some protesters even demanding investigations into all the politicians who had supported Henard. The tide had decisively turned against her, and the support she once commanded now seemed like a distant memory in a last-ditch attempt to stem the tide of public opinion. Henard released a video statement, sticking to the same defiant talking points. "This is just a politically motivated attack," she declared. "I have devoted my life to serving the city, and the truth will be revealed. I will not be intimidated." But the internet was unforgiving. Comment sections flooded with backlash, and one user summed up the public sentiment. Asterisk, where's the fake news when we have documents, recordings, and witnesses? You're done. Just resigned despite the mounting pressure. Henyard refused to back down. She called a press conference, her posture as defiant as ever. But the media weren't letting her off the hook. Reporters pressed her on the mounting allegations, asking how she responded to the growing evidence against her. Henyard stood her ground, accusing the media, her political rivals, and even the federal government of unfairly targeting her. "This is an attack on strong, independent leadership," she exclaimed. "They want to silence me because I didn't follow their rules, but by then, it no longer mattered." The narrative had already shifted, and Henyard's position was rapidly becoming untenable. That night, after major news stations concluded their coverage, a bombshell dropped. FBI agents, backed by state officials, executed a search warrant at Henyard's residence and workplace. The first time in history that federal agents had raided the home of a sitting mayor. Reporters flooded the scene as agents carried away boxes of documents, hard drives, and computers. The image of Henyard handcuffed and escorted from her property went viral within minutes, marking a definitive moment in her fall from grace to charges against her, including wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit bribery, carried the potential for long prison sentences. Legal experts speculated on TV that Henyard could face over 20 years behind bars if convicted. As the evidence continued to pile up, many believed a plea deal might be her only option. The city, once enthralled by her leadership, now found itself in a state of shock and anticipation. Some citizens felt like they had seen this downfall coming from miles away, while others were left in stunned disbelief. By morning, the political landscape had shifted completely. Allies who had once praised Henard began distancing themselves, and investigators revealed that other officials tied to Henard were also under investigation. The web of corruption was spreading, and Henard's empire, once thought invincible, was rapidly unraveling thanks to watching celeb news.